Well, good evening. I'm Chris Roman. I'm an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Oceanography and one of the co-coordinators of this year's Honors Colloquium lecture series. And on behalf of my fellow coordinators, Peter Canillan, also from the Graduate School of Oceanography, and Judith Swith from the Coastal Resources Center, and about a dozen other places on campus. Welcome to the 10th lecture in our series examining technological changes and what they're going to mean for our lives in the future. So as they say on Car Talk, we are in the third half of the show, and we are looking at societal consequences of these technologies and what they may bring. So as you've been paying attention, we've seen everything from printing human organs to turning cells into circuits to directly controlling the brain and then plowing through the vast conversation of mass media and social media looking for a global conversation. So it's not hard to see the ethical, societal, and even human questions that are going to be in our near future. Right? And so tonight's lecture will focus on ethics and these related to these technologies. And we're also very happy that we have an ethicist here to speak in Rhode Island, and we didn't have to issue a subpoena first. So, I mentioned that joke to Laurie earlier, and she didn't quite get it. That's because she's from Chicago. So tonight's lecture series would not be possible without our sponsors, the G. Unger Vedelson Foundation, the URI Honors Program, the URI Graduate School of Oceanography, and tonight's lecture is also co-sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences. And we're always happy for our classroom media services and assistants for keeping the lights on and everything working each week. So for the basics, put your cell phones away, the typical stuff here, get ready to go. Any noisy things, do them now. For reference, there are restrooms in the back of the auditorium and downstairs, and the exits are on the sides of the stage, the back of the auditorium, and the back and the sides. At the conclusion of the lecture, as always, we'll entertain questions from the audience. We'll ask you to submit those 3 ways. So there are cards, which you may have received when you walked in. During the lecture, if you have a question, please fill out the card, pass it, once it's filled out, to the center aisle, and our student volunteers will walk through and pick them up. As soon as you're done, pass it in, and they'll come through and get them, so we have them as soon as they're done. You can use your cell phone to text questions to this 401-824-7444. Those are up here. We'll collect those, and you can also send a question via email to hcquestion@gmail.com. So sign your name to the questions, let us know who you are, and please send your questions in early and often to increase your chances of being read. So if you're watching at home, welcome, and please, if you want to send in questions, feel free, but also if you're at home, send an email to this HC question with the word survey in lowercase in the subject. We're taking a poll to see who's out there. Please tell us where you are and who you're watching with and what you're up to. We did this last week, and just for reference, we got replies back from Florida, University of Southern California, quite a few spots. So you have to, I guess, think big, as they say. So to the main event, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Laurie Zoloth. Laurie is an ethicist who concentrates on genetic medicine, stem cell research, and justice in healthcare allocation. She's a director of the Center of Bioethics, Science, and Society, a professor of medical ethics and humanities at Northwestern University in the Feinberg School of Medicine. She's also a professor of religion and a member of the Jewish Studies faculty at Northwestern University in the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences. And she's a director of the Brady Program in Ethics and Civic Life. Outside the university, she's a founding board member and currently serves on the boards of the International Society for Stem Cell Research, the Society for Scriptural Reasoning, and the Society for Neuroethics. And recently, she was elected president of the American Academy of Religion. She's also written and collaborated on several books, including Healthcare and the Ethics of Encounter and the Human Embryonic Stem Cell Debate, Ethics, Religion, and Policy. So by anyone's standards, Laurie has forged an enviable career, and there's much more, but I don't want to go on and waste the rest of your hour. So with that, please welcome Laurie Zoloth to the stage.
Well, I am quite pleased to be here in Rhode Island. I am an ethicist, that is true. I'm not the first ethicist here. Dan Brock, I've spent many lovely years in Rhode Island and always said how fabulous it was, and it is a fabulous place to be. I'm saying this because Everybody else, until you got to me, has been telling you about wonderful and exciting things, right? Things being printed for you, organs being printed, and nanotechnology and synthetic biology. And here I am, a specialist in healthcare reform, not going so well. Stem cell research is having a rough day today. I don't know if you see the paper about stem cell research. And, genetics, and I'm going to start to worry about genetics for you. So here I am as an ethicist saying, yes, the future is fabulous, but because I also have a degree in Jewish studies and 5 children, I'm going to also say we need to worry about this. So how I think about this is I'm an optimist, but I'm a worried optimist. I kind of feel about the future the way I feel about flying on United Airlines. We'll get there as long as I worry carefully all along the way. Right. So, all right. So let's begin, because I want to talk about the ethical challenges in genetics, and I want to talk about bioethics in the human future, what awaits us, and how we evaluate, how we decide what good science should look like in the future. And how does the science shape us? And are we just passive in that discussion? Or are we shapers of the science and shapers of the world before it's presented to us? So non-reactive bioethics, what would that look like? What is good science? And what do we mean by that? Okay, so first I want to say thank you. Not only thank you to all the people that helped make this event possible, the wonderful dinner and a fabulous honors class, and students in the class you can't give the answers to the test later, and wonderful faculty members, a beautiful university. These sessions are remarkable. It's awesome that they're being broadcast live, and thank you for all the people that helped make it happen. Also people who, on this slide, who helped me think through both science and religion, and who ask the tough questions that make my life so interesting. So thanks first. I'm going to start with this, telling you where we're going first, kind of giving you a roadmap, asking you to be the navigators on my ship here, and tell you I'm going to start with definitions like all good moral philosophers. I'm going to give you a test, so I'm not up here alone thinking about these questions. I'm going to raise the question about why we worry about the genetic future, but also why we love the genetic future, what we yearn for in the genetic future. I'm going to say that I think we need to rethink not only the technology, but the language in which we think about genetics. I'm going to give you the test answers and grades right away. I'm in the university, what can I say? And then I'm going to give some final notes on freedom and fate, and what I think is the most interesting problem that confronts us about the human future was our question about the poor, and about ownership, and about the meaning of having itself. What does it mean to have a future, to own a future, to have a body, to exchange within bodies? And those questions that aren't scientific, but are profoundly normative and will shape us as well. Okay? Did you agree to that plan? Do I have informed consent for this talk? Okay. So first of all, what is ethics? Okay. We can begin, right? What do you think? Any ideas? You can shout it out. You don't have to type it on an iPad. We could talk. Right. What? Yeah. Okay. Morality. Someone's going to try. Anything else? Come on, there's one lawyer in this group. Who's going to say something about law? Maybe? Right? Okay, let me ask the question. How is it ethics different from morality? Why? If I came up here and I said, Zoloth, she's a famous moralist, right? Wouldn't that feel different? Wouldn't that be different? And why? Okay. So how about if I said I'm a lawyer and I'm in charge of regulation? I'm neither of those things because ethics is about an evaluation of science, about its methods and its norms and its goals. It struggles with what we do when we have many different answers, possibilities, competing moral appeals, and no already settled subject, no already settled questions, no already settled answers, but a competition at the earliest stages about definitions, about how we do the work, what should be the norms, and the telos, where we're going with the work. The central question of ethics is what is the right act and what makes it so? what is the right act? What makes it so? What's our justification for our choices? Now, consider how we decide. Of all the technologies that you saw in that spectacular little video, how do you know if they're good? How do you know what the right thing to do is? I thought I'd tell you. Oh, no. All right. 3 classic responses. The first one is one we think about, we'd love to use in these settings, is simply to think, well, how's it going to turn out? We call this consequentialism. Those of us who like utility or happiness want to think about the greatest good for the greatest number, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But all of these ideas of, well, it's not going to turn out so well, or it may harm us in some ways, rest on this idea of judging things by trying to figure out in advance what the future brings and how the consequences will affect us. You see the problem with this new technology if we only use consequentialism, right? Because why? Because we can't really know what the next new thing will be and what effect it will have on us. It's only a best guess, and most of our best guesses come out of our deepest fears, actually. Just read any science fiction book and you'll see it doesn't turn out well, these sort of dystopias that science creates. But the impulse to judge activities by how it affects is how it works in a democracy. It's how we make decisions, largely, are utilitarian considerations. And the whole premise of how we test something uses the bodies of others so we can learn in small and incremental ways how it might turn out in 10 people, in 50 people, in 2,000 people, okay, all of us. And that slow trying things out is based on this idea that you could know the consequences in increasingly larger groupings, and you would know how it might turn out. Okay, so that's one way. How many people think, okay, that's enough? Do we want another way? What's the problem with this? It's dark, it's hard. What's the problem with just saying the greatest good for the greatest number? Well, who decides, for one? What else? It's hard to guess in advance. There's one other problem that's really became vivid around the question of slavery, right? It could, yes, over here. Yeah, what about the minority? What about the not greatest number? What if it's really terrible, right, for a handful of you to be the slaves of, say, let's say this side of the audience. Just over here, they look hardy, right? And couldn't you use them in your day-to-day lives, for instance? And these group of people, you could enslave. There's more of you than there are of them. And you could, I could like scoop them up. We have the students, they could gather them, they could scoop them up, they could deliver them to you, and you wouldn't whip them or anything. And it would be for the greatest good of the greatest number to, in fact, use these people on this side of the auditorium. Are we getting anxious over here? Right? To be the slaves of these people over here. Each of you could take home one of them, and it would be the greatest good for the greatest number, purely a consequentialist determination. You'd be really happy. I know, I'd be happy, right? And, you know, what would be the harm using a purely consequentialist determination? The great problem of injustice is embedded in this calculation. And that's one of the problems with judging the outcomes of even the best technology, is how do you hear the voice of minorities? Okay. So the next way to think about this is not to think about the consequences, but to think about fundamental human duties. Now, consequentialism is trying to guess the future. Deontology, or duty-based reasoning, says, what about the past? What have I promised? What's the contract of a democratic society, of a pluralistic society? What do we owe one another? What obligations? So, what are my role-specific duties, and how do I enact them? And what sorts of duties are engaged when I do the science? And what assumptions am I making when I do the science? To who am I obligated? And how does that go? If, for instance, a scientist has a role-specific duty to always tell you the truth and to always be entirely truthful, what happens when he or she spins off a company right? And then there's another competing goal to be a good businessman and to make a profit, which might be withholding information. What about those two duties in conflict, those conflicts of interest? So looking at essential rights and norms and duties in deontology does give us another way to decide what's right. Now, the final way is to look at what's called virtue theory. And this is a very interesting way to think about the human future. Virtue theory looks at the arc of response over a long period of time. So Aristotle was a virtue theorist, and those of you who studied Catholic moral theology know that Aquinas thought a lot of Aristotle. Jews think about Maimonides as a variation of this. And here the question is, what is a good act and what makes it so is determined by how it shapes me. What does this act make of me over time? Does it require that I lie? And how would that shape me? Virtue theorists often ask for us to look to an exemplar, to someone we admire, and then ask, how would that person act in this situation? For Christians, it's often Jesus as an exemplar. But for some other people, it could be, say, Martin Luther King or John Kennedy or whoever your hero might be, right? What would she do at this moment? How can I be like her in confronting it? Or we can talk in an ideal society and say, in an ideal society, and how do we get there? How does it shape us? Every act will shape you. Every moral gesture will shape you. Every choice shapes you. And virtue theorists say the goodness or badness of the technology or the evil in technology is really in how it might shape us slowly over time and calls us to attention about this. So these are three classic responses. We generally use variations of all of these when we think and evaluate technology. And notice, I'm not going to talk too much about specific technology. I want to give you a framework for looking at any new technological advance, okay, however elusive the actual thing might be. So in asking the question, what is a good scientist, I'm asking you a question that's sort of interesting, because what do I mean by that? Do I mean that there's a real world, an actual world, as opposed to all social construction, and that science is important because science helps us to understand and uncover truth? Like, the best science is the one that's the most truthful. Is that what I mean? Or do I mean that there's significant problems of poverty and hunger and injustice in the world, or suffering in the world, and the best science is the one that addresses the most terrible problem? Another way to evaluate it. Or do I mean that scientists are good people and we ought to trust them, and that good science is science that's done by scientists with a decent enterprise, who aim in the right way and have a good will as they aim there? You can see my Kantian roots here coming out. The only thing that is good is the good will. Is that what I mean by is our scientists good? Can you trust them as individuals? Are they trustworthy scientists? Another way. These are, again, different ways to judge what do we mean when we shape our human future, in whose hands do we allow our human future to be crafted? Now here's another question for you. Is total freedom necessary to be good? Right? Anyone think that? Do you need total freedom in doing science or not? Anyone going to raise their hand? Does anyone think complete freedom? Okay, so nobody thinks complete freedom. Well, that's good. Because then the question emerges, then what freedom are you willing to curtail? How do you regulate? If science is free speech, and I fundamentally believe it is, basic science, how should it be limited to be good science? Should we ever limit science? Who's the we in that sentence? And in what way does the regulation unfold? Who does it, and how does it work? Okay, so what else besides freedom is needed to be good? Some ideas, besides a free society, have been raised. It's about funding. Funding that is not constrained to benefit only the wealthy, but is so structured as to benefit all who would then derive goods from the science that we create together. And finally, for many of us who think about justice, a system for distribution that meets some standard of decency, ideally far more than just a basic decent minimum, ideally science should be so directed so that it ought to be distributed in some way, and you can choose your way, so that it allows the greatest amount of human flourishing. So if there's wonderful organs printed out in advance, or fabulous nanotechnology materials, if they are done fairly and under conditions of fairness, there has to be some way that if they become objects of mutual use and mutual good, they're distributed fairly. If it just turns out that this cool human future, like flying on United Airlines with first class, right? Then, and the rest of us are sort of in economy class with our knees crimped up to our chins, watching the nanotechnology in the front, it won't be ethical, right? So, this is because people don't just have a right to science. We have to figure out what our duties around science are. So, what this means is the following. I'm happy to fund science robustly. In some ways, among the most robust funding should be to education and to science, I believe, because we believe that scientists have this funny capacity to poke holes in what's real, to look at what's real and to look at what's known and say, maybe not. Maybe that's not true. Maybe those limits that we see all around us aren't real limits. We allow and we pay scientists to undermine what we think is known, to sort of live outside the law and live outside the box. But to live outside the law, you must be honest, to quote Bob Dylan. And we have to trust that, in fact, you are honest when you do science. The right to basic science-free speech draws its power and draws its authority from the duty to tell the truth and stand up for all humanity. That's a quote from Sidney Brenner, a great American scientist, who said there's really two duties in science, and then we give them all these rights to tell the truth and to stand up for all humanity. So, that's the basics about science being good and being judgeable and discernible. And I'm going to argue that one of your duties, each of you in this room, not just ethicists, but each of you as citizens in this room, have a duty to judge and discern what is good science. I think you also have a duty to fund it, but you have to judge it. You have to know it. You have to think about it and learn it. That's why it's fabulous that the Rhode Island University is doing this lecture series, so you hear the cutting-edge ideas, but then you have to assess them. Now, just a basic piece now about genes and genetic future, because that was my assignment to think about. Of course, genes are what we call clusters of information in all organisms, in every cell, in humans and animals and plants and microbes, all the things that are inherited in units from parents or parental units. And then we know, of course, that biological development and activity is controlled by the genes in an organism's cell in part, and they play a critical role in enabling a living thing to live and to function and to reproduce in this environment. Living things, of course, have many genes in common, right? They are highly conserved between one species to another, which is one of the ways we know Darwin was essentially correct. But there's also important differences. Humans actually have not that many genes. We have fewer than ragweed, for instance, 30,000 genes on a human genome, maybe even less. Some plants have far more than this. And the genes, of course, carry the code for proteins, the main building blocks for cells and tissues, and we used to think of this in a very straightforward way. Genes led to proteins, led to activities in a linear way. That's not as true anymore. We've learned about the essential stochasticism of this sequence, of epigenetic effects and environmental effects, and the fact that some genes are active, some are toned up, some are toned down, some turn off, some flicker, and the combination of active genes when they're active and environmental influences create for us the organism's traits. Now, traits define us within a general notion of a human genome with variations. We know that there's genetic influences and environmental influences, and some traits are influenced by a complex interaction of many genes, and environmental influences may even have a greater influence on the trait at certain times in development than at other times. In the 1970s, scientists found ways to transfer specific genes from one species to another, and that whole process, as you know, is called genetic modification. We often call these GMO, meaning GMO, genetically modified organisms. And GMO often involves a single gene or a single protein because complex traits, because of their elusiveness and their complexity, are harder to engineer or to modify, even though in every science fiction movie it seems quite simple. It turns out it's not, especially in humans. But GM makes possible some things not possible through the older technique of GM, which was selective breeding. Now, human beings have done genetic modification since the earliest records of our being human beings. Anyone who's a reader of Hebrew scripture knows that the breeding of goats and the creation of Jacob's herd as a spotted herd had to do with a selective breeding technique, one that everyone thinks is quite clever in the story, correct? And leads to his enormous success. And he's doing selective breeding, selective modification. Anyone who reads Darwin knows of Darwin's fascination, long before GM intervention, with breeding his dogs. He also had children, but he does tell us that he sort of prefers his dogs. So this modification of organisms to suit human needs is one of the oldest encounters between humans and in the world in which they see and find themselves that we have records of. But this specificity of genetic modification since the 1970s has made much more specific changes possible. And you heard in the earlier series about the extraordinary things now possible with in genetic modification. The simplest example is winter flounder, a fish that whose gene for resisting cold and damage during freezing was transferred to a tomato plant to take the freezer saver, the saver tomatoes, seen there. And in principle, this GM can add a trait to a species from any animal, plant, or microbe, but in practice, some things work better than others. It turns out that flounder gene does keep tomatoes from freezing and works pretty well, but there can be unintended side effects. A fish may display different behavior than the original fish, or a transfer gene could introduce new proteins that hook along to the target protein, and some people then can have allergies to these proteins. So genetic modification, first technology that we think about when we think about the genetic future. The second one is genetic testing. And genetic testing is becoming a common part of our lives, especially as people confront having children. And today's USA Today has a second-page story that talks about a remarkable new advance in genetic testing. This was the ability to test women, not their fetuses, but blood from the woman, the mother who is carrying, at 10 weeks, carrying a pregnancy, to determine if she has a child with trisomy 13, 21, or 18, Down syndrome, trisomy 21, or not, to see if the chromosomes in her child are the normal complement of chromosomes, or if she has a variation, which really changes things. It means you don't have to have a prenatal test, an amniotic fluid or chorionic villus sampling test, which might endanger the pregnancy, opening the way to testing pregnant women very, very early in pregnancy and in a non-invasive way. Now, some diseases that are a result of a single change in one gene that you will inevitably get can be tested for now. But you can also test for carrier status, as in Tay Sachs. Now, panels of genetic testing are available. In fact, there's a Jewish panel that tests for a lot of diseases that are more common in Ashkenazi Jews. And there's African American panels, and there's other different panels in population, based on population probabilities. Panels of these tests are available, but the question is, which should be offered? Should they all be offered? What does it mean, and how expensive, and how is that going to be paid for? And some tests only reveal a tendency toward the disease. Breast cancer, BRCA1, BRCA2, those oncogenes mean that you're more likely to get the gene, but you won't certainly more likely to get the cancer, but won't certainly with 100% certainty get the cancer, unlike Huntington's or Tay Sachs. Should we test for those probability genes, and what does that mean? And what about conditions that will only manifest themselves like breast cancer in adulthood, 30 years from now, when in fact we may have a cure? Should those be part of predictive testing? So these are the series of questions that are raised by genetic testing. Now, gene therapy, genetic therapeutics came forward with enormous early optimism. It's not really yet realized. There is one rare disease, X-linked SCIDS, that has yielded to genetic changes. Because there's newly understood complexities in genes and protein and behavior theory, There's new challenges, and some of the great cases in bioethics have had to do with the tragic failure of genetic therapy, as in the Jesse Gelsinger case, which we can talk more about that happened at the University of Pennsylvania, in which a gene trial ended up in the death of human subjects, and there was considerable concern about whether we're really ready to alter genes within human subjects, whether we're ready for testing or not. Early trials, very optimistic. Present reality, less so. Genetic enhancements led to this. Long-standing debate. If you had a measure of capacity to enhance genetically and papers in bioethics about genetic enhancements, it'd be very out of balance. Many people have been concerned about designer babies, for instance. Paper after paper in the thousands about the moral panic that we might create designer babies. And in fact, very little done in that direction about genetic enhancement. No applications yet at all. People are actually turning to, drugs to get better SAT scores, but genetically, it's not happening. Genetic sequencing and personalized medicine is a promise that's been had many times. People who work with the NIH know that there was a long time after the Genome Project was sequenced when Francis Collins would hold up a chip and say, there's going to be a personalized medicine chip. You're going to go to your doctor. Your genome is going to be sequenced for under $1,000, maybe under $100. And you'll be able to walk in, and your doctor will know exactly what you are genetically predisposed for and exactly what sort of drug will work best for your particular type. It's still quite expensive. Theoretically, it should work. It's unclear to me whether we'll ever be able to fund this given our present situation. And then there's many problems that are much more obvious that are not discussed. Like you can now walk into your doctor's office and be like 50 pounds overweight, right? You don't need a gene test to tell you this, and yet that's still not addressed or dealt with. So my question is, why do we need the gene chip again when the most obvious problems still have not been addressed? But that's just me. And then I want to say a small aside, people were worried about if you knew your genetic sequence, if someone knew it, then it would be, you'd have a lack of privacy. Right? And when we give tissue samples to tissue banks, or what I like to call tissue libraries, when we give these samples, the question is, could they be anonymized, or is that completely no longer valid in a genetic era when you can always be traced back to your gene? And the reality is, if you give a tissue sample of any type, of course it can be linked back to you. They might change the name, but your sequence is your sequence is your sequence that is, in fact, uniquely identifiable, raising interesting questions about privacy. And finally, we hear about synthetic biology, and this is really the next step on fascinating and intriguing technology, because here you don't even need naturally occurring DNA sequences at all. Here, synthetic biologists, as you heard, see DNA as just a series of chemicals, right? That can be combined in any sort of sequence, and using completely synthetic chemicals, they can create novel DNA or RNA sequences, which, as far as we know, do not exist in nature. They can create new parts or bricks that mimic living organisms, and these stretches of synthetic DNA can be transferred from organism to organism because organisms do little mechanical pieces that can be swapped out of protein creation that might be useful. So you've heard about these extraordinary ideas. So then why so controversial? Well, I'm going to give you 4 ideas about why it's controversial and then look at each of these controversies in some detail. First, I think that the way that people in religion, in philosophy, and maybe in ordinary life learn to think about something, learn to know something, is seeing how it works as a whole. It's a theory of knowledge that says, how I know what is real is to see the various parts and see how it comes together as a whole. And in fact, knowing something, knowing the cumulative reality of something, is not paying as much attention to the individual parts, but seeing the larger system. Okay? That's one theory of knowledge. The molecular biologists think about the world in a different way. Here, they, and perhaps as physicists might, see the world as more true in its smaller pieces. And our nanotechnology colleagues are the masters of this, the very smallest pieces, that you can really know how the world works by breaking it down into its smallest component units, its simplest structures, its molecules, its cells, its parts of cells. And if you could fully know and characterize each part, then you could take it, you would know. To know is to make. say the synthetic biologists. If I can't really make it, I can't really understand it. And so there's this notion of like the parts of the world spread out over the floor of the garage or the lab, and then you could really know something, because you can take the parts apart and put it back together. So genetics awakens in us this notion of the deconstruction of what we know into little teeny parts. It raises for us this idea of, but is that really, are they going to be able to put it back together? And is that really true about it? So that theory of knowledge, I think, is a challenging one, the scientific theory of knowledge. Secondly, there's been a lot of big claims made using a lot of big knowledge. And the kind of big language that's often used is apocryphal language, is resurrective language, is language about birth and death and new and literally resurrection. In stem cells, immaculate conception, creating without the normal narrative of human creation. The language that promises a whole new world is very similar to us in religious theory to the language of Scripture, where a new man can be created, a new woman can be created, a new self is possible, only if. And so the big claims and the big language really resonate with us, and they both excite us and alarm us. Third is it really raises an interesting question about whether we're free. And as Americans, we struggle with this a lot. Are we free, or are we not? If an electrode can be put in my brain, and I can suddenly not be concerned about something that I was formerly concerned about, what does that mean about my fatedness or my freedom or my ability to think through my own actions if I can just have a little luminescent light placed into a part of my brain and then literally think differently? Do the genes control my fate, my behaviors? We sort of believe that, but what about that notion of freedom? Am I who I am born to be? Do my genes define my being? Which is very close for many Americans to your parents then defined your being, your situation defines your being, your family defines your being, as opposed to a great American trope that you can make yourself new despite your fatedness. Fourth is this idea that are we equal or are we not? If we look at genetics and we see dissimilar traits, are we only bequeath a set of chances that depend on parentage and may or may not be fair? And how much does effort count? And fifth, there's a disconnect between a very deep moral panic and dozens of cool movies and the actual interventions that have become possible. And actual interventions need actual bodies and actual labs and actual money to fund them. And some of our anxieties are, is it hype or is it real? So these are some of the overriding controversies. And classically, ethicists have responded by saying we should worry about what's called genetic determinism, about privacy, about discrimination, about fairness and access, about fears of exploitation, and about slippery slopes. And I'm going to go into these in more detail. First of all, I want to say that science is always public. It isn't something that happens alone in a lab. This is a good thing that American science is an observed public act, and I like that idea that it's not a private act. Science issues are on ballots. They should be on ballots. You may not like how it turns out, but then if you're a scientist, it's your duty to educate people so citizens can vote on this critical issue of our day. Science is around poll questions, and the University of Rhode Island faculty have this enormous and interesting, intriguing database about science after this lecture series. Scientists have become members in public debates. Notice that issues around science are at the core of the upcoming presidential debates, just like they were last time. And academic scientists are writing petitions about ideas, and science is centered in the public in a way that is critically important because of the importance of science itself. And these debates focus then on the concerns that I'm now going to go into. There are 13 reasons, I'm going to argue, that the public really does fear the genetic future. And whether we're discussing stem cells or cloning or any of the variations that you saw on new science, these 13 ideas and problems come up over and over again. So widely discussed, by the way, in the press, as I said, and in public, and in science. Every year there's a new science fiction movie that takes up one of these themes. This year it's Apes and Epidemics, The Planet of the Apes and Contagion, 2 stories about genetic alteration and its possibilities. And all of these can be seen as sort of a genre called the promises and perils of the new biology, so I'm going to turn to those critiques. The first thing that people think about is they worry that DNA is the really, really real. Now, the way we moderns think about DNA is a little bit the way medievalists thought about the soul. That there was this thing, a physical thing inside of us that was sort of coiled in us and defined us and was us, was our from the moment of our being, there was this separate being. And that, by the way, it was eternal. It lived beyond our bodies. You could keep DNA, you could store DNA, you could have dinosaur DNA and then recreate it. And increasingly, our moral status, our bodies, is our self. And therefore, people worry that any touch of the DNA is really a touch to something that seems like a soul. It should be impermissible because of its near sacredness. Secondly, there's a debate about dignity, and dignity here has to do with being intact. And to be dignified, our dignity, our self, requires this unaltered intactness. Our ipsity, our self, our identity, and our uniqueness has to do with our unique DNA-ness. And so most of all, destroying any human or embryo is wrong, but that any DNA, any touch of any DNA to any creature changes that creature in a way that is wrong at all, and it alters the essence of both being and creation itself. Third, there is this idea that nature is fixed, that both human nature is just the way it is, all humans are like that, and that the nature, the green, the living world is just a fixed place, and it has borders that shouldn't be broached without violation, without the sense of being violated. And here, in this way, species boundaries are particularly important to keep intact. Fourth is that nature is not only fixed and hierarchical, but it's normative, meaning it gives us good rules. It suggests rules and laws, and if left free, will become morally good. It will express itself in some harmony, and our use and our machines interfere with this goodness of nature, and in fact, create evil and are threatening. If you read, many American novelists have this notion of like you shouldn't use tractors, you should use horses. Walker Piercy, others are along these lines, right? There is an order to nature, goes this theory that's inherently wise, maybe even sort of feminine, and is self-correcting, that men and machines alter or change, and that the newness, the modernity itself is an attack on this normativity. And you can see this like when there's a tsunami, people say, well, they shouldn't have built those houses on the beach, as opposed to, golly, there's the tsunami. So notice the tension around human activities and nature. A fifth argument against genetic changes is that it will change who we are as beings because it might eliminate or reduce the burden of suffering. And that suffering and its noble acceptance is the great teacher of our need and of our love. And without suffering, we would somehow become soulless. And people who often make a critique about why make genetic interventions to eliminate disabilities make the critique that having among us people who are differently abled makes us a better human species, makes us more noble, makes us more kind. It's an argument we hear often. We have this idea that death defines us, and our technology is really secretly about immortality. Kurzweil says it's not so secret, it's about immortality. 6, people oppose genetic futures and worry about them because they worry about slippery slopes. Now, philosophers do not like slippery slopes, but people use slippery slope arguments a lot. We think they're bad arguments. But the idea here is that if you begin or create, or use a technology, there's just no way to stop it from being used for ever larger and more progressively trivial or common purpose. And we've all seen this. Remember when email was sort of new, when you had like a few little emails, and now there's this cascade? The other thing is that at the bottom of the slippery slope, it awaits for us what's called the shadow of history, meaning Nazis. Meaning if you start making a few little enhancements, you'll end up trying to make a master race. If you start making, eliminating babies with Tay Sachs, you'll end up eliminating Ashkenazi Jews. Notice the progression, because it has happened before, in a terrifying, rapid, and frightening way around a set of ideas. Not technologies, but ideas. And of course, the problem, the long history of forced sterilization in the United States, and the movie Gattaca, which takes you right to the bottom of the slippery slope in the first 20 minutes. 7 is, Richard Clark's not here, but I thought I'd put in what he might say, dual use. People worry about the biosecurity problem of all this new technology. Evil people will take whatever you make for good and even great good into weapons, right? I could take this nice Rhode Island cup and toss it into the audience and start whacking you with it, ever the more so with my genetically altered organism. But it is a terrifying thing. And by the way, people have taken every new technology and they have turned it into weapons, so probably there's no difference. How do we avoid this? It's a great concern. Such technology gives you unprecedented power. And that kind of power could potentially enslave us. And the history of our species certainly did include genocidal actions among people who are different from us in any one of particular traits. 8 is that mistakes are inevitable. Now, 3 Mile Island, the first large mistake, local story. Need we say more? And we can say more. Mongoose in Hawaii and sparrows in North America. But tsunamis and BP Deep Horizon stories, why did they insist the stories of mistake after mistake after mistake? They're going to happen. How can we avoid it? And the unintended consequences, even when people are trying to do good, the error that's inherent in these technologies, and if the technologies are bigger and more powerful and promise us more, then they can be mistaken more vividly as well. 9 is that we're supposed not to be in power. We're supposed to have finitude. We're supposed to be contingent creatures. And what should define us is our fragility, not our control. New technologies, this effort to live forever, and this mastery of the world denies people the chance at real freedom. Again, a theme of Gattaca and of nearly every science fiction movie is that great power corrupts so greatly, and that great power wielded by scientists and new technologies offers unprecedented possibilities for social control. 10 is that we'll be like gods. It's the second tree. Not only do we take the tree of knowledge, but oh no, they're going to go to this other tree as well. And that, in fact, it's death that leads us to our aspirations. Aspirations acted upon as itself the core of happiness, said Leon Cass. Real happiness is not being happy, but achieving your finest aspirations, he argued. And there's a strong history of this anxiety that long predates modernism. It's a pre-modern fear of the slippage between the gods on Olympus, animals on the ground, and us creatures. That the boundaries in Greek mythology are very slippery between gods and humans, and we broach them at great cost. 11 is one about the marketplace. The marketplace will distort science. And as the marketplace becomes more powerful, and as people begin to make decisions, the decision that you're going to hear about tomorrow about the Geron stem cell trial being ended, because of marketplace considerations, we see over and over again the enormity of the power of the marketplace. And the mix of marketplace and science is troubling, should be troubling. The very success implied by, say, synthetic biology, its very widespread applications, alerts us to this danger of the creation of a powerful commodity. And one of the questions that's important for you as citizens to ask is always, who will profit from this? And where does that profit go? Even good scientists, really good scientists who want to rush their products to market are tempted by the profits promised by Big Pharma, and that's just reality. And I'm not opposing it. In general, I'm just saying mixing it with science creates questions, I think, ethical ones. Conflicts of interest do alter our integrity. They don't always have to be about the Integra versus Merck level, but think about Jonas Salk, who refused to patent the polio vaccine because he said, you might as well ask me to patent the sun. Linked to this is this unfair world problem. How would the goods created be distributed? And we should only be working on social solutions and not high-tech ones, goes the argument. And it will create a class of haves and have-nots that will just worsen the existing injustices. And finally, when we think about synthetic biology, or some of this high-tech stuff, We think about the problem of just being synthetic, not being real, not being, just being inauthentic, that somehow it's a kind of fake out to use the synthetic biology, or that it's immoral, it's a kind of cheating or lying, or that inauthenticity is violent in that it displaces a part of the real. Okay. Those are the challenges. What can be said about them? Well, I think there's three things that we can see and we can agree on are true about these challenges. First is that every single one of these claims has real validity. They're not trivial problems. They're more than trivially correct, and any sensible person can argue with some version of each of those claims, each of those statements. The trouble begins largely in their extremity. Slopes are slippery, but they're not impossibly slippery, right? Nature has some norms and rules, but isn't nice. Things like this. So going back and thinking about the extremity and how they're used politically, beyond arguments, I think alerts us to their trouble. Secondly, you can say it's true that these claims create significant new political alliances, and they're different alliances. You can't say that these are right-wing attacks on science. Some of them are left-wing attacks on science. Some of them are religious attacks on science, and some of them are irreligious attacks on science. They come from all over the place. The EU has just said that you can't patent stem cells. The European Union is opposing the patenting of stem cells and any products derived from an embryo at all. Can't patent it. Who promoted that? Not the Vatican. Greenpeace. So you can see how they come from very different directions. The the opposition to GM foods is not a conservative opposition to science. It's a left-wing opposition to science. So you can see attacks on science coming from many different directions. Thirdly, I'm going to make the claim that all of these claims have a faith-based component. They're all profoundly religious and deeply felt religious statements. They're statements of faith. They're statements of a worldview. They're statements of eschatology or end of days. They're not real moral arguments using classic justification. They're statements of faith. The world is like this. Nature is like that. Human nature is a certain way. And because they're that sort of statement, they cannot be entirely agreed upon in a pluralistic democracy where we just don't agree about those statements. And like many faith claims in the world, they are deeply eschatological in nature, like much of thinking about the future is. They're not based in what we're worried about now, or you'd be thinking about foster care and the lack of universal access to health care as our main problem. They're based on a then, on a future then, on a world to come. And they focus on that world to come with increasing specificity and excitement. Okay, so then we asked, how do you know? So those are your arguments. Now we're going to do a quick, and you're going to have to raise your hand and think about these questions, because I don't want to be out here alone to ask the questions about a few bioethics answers. So let's just choose a few of the ideas for the test questions that are now available to us after your lecture series. And here's one I want to think about. Genetic selection can be used to avoid major genetic disabilities. But what about subtle ones? What is the right act and what makes it so? And so here's the idea. There is a condition that affects some embryos. It causes them to be shorter in stature and to suffer some weakness with some bleeding and some associated pain. And given this condition, some occupations are closed to people with this condition. And given this condition, the patients never achieve parity in income or economic status. Now, we can diagnose this condition prior to birth. Should we avoid this condition? Should genetics be used to eliminate a disability like this? How many think so? Some hands in the air. How many think no? Don't avoid this condition. Okay, so, and why would that be? It's women. Okay, you got it. A smart audience, all right. Okay, so that seems like an obvious one, but what about this one? What about if you wanted to use genetics to make us better, to make us just better? What if memory could be enhanced in such conditions as Alzheimer's, in which memory is, of course, progressively lost? Should memory-enhancing medication be available in a wider sense, not just for Alzheimer's? And to who? How many think that if there was memory-enhancing medication, kind of like in Rise of the Planets of the Apes, but working, should it be available to everyone who's elderly? What do you think? Raise your hand. How about to all students who need it for their exams? How about everyone in law enforcement, for instance, right? Or all musicians? So where would you stop? Should we all just have better memories? Now, can you make the case that memory-enhancing medication, if proven to be safe and effective, might be a basic healthcare benefit to which all are entitled, right? Maybe, so is anyone opposed to this idea? If you could do something that would genetically enhance your memory, should you be able to pass that down to your children? How many want to be able to do that? Not only is my memory changed, but I create the ability to maintain that trait. Yes? Okay, we're happy with this. So already we're getting into this memory thing. Okay, what else enhancements did you want? Who wants a stronger immune system? Who wants to be stronger or more agile or faster? Right? How about able to see complexity? Right? Or able to need less sleep? Okay, students. Right? Notice how these changes we would all do medically if we could do them genetically and they would be safe and permanent and heritable. What would be the wrong? If, besides the justice issue. Now here's another case. A couple has come for prenatal counseling, and they have 4 embryos, and they have to decide which one to implant. They only wish to avoid disease. They don't want to enhance a child. They're just nice religious people, actually, and yet you're the ethicist in this case. So you have to tell them everything you know about the situation. Or do you? You understand that they don't want to make their child taller, or more musical, or better at math, or a better athlete. We all just said we wanted that. But these are religious people, and you're an ethicist. So they just want to choose an embryo that would be nicer, that would have a better chance of being good. Okay? What if you could do this? More nurturing, a child who's more nurturing. It's a simple but a small change in one part of the genetic code. I mean, after all, isn't that my whole job, to try to make you good? Okay? So here's some facts with which you may decide. Recent studies show you can tell personality tendencies from some genetic tests. And there's ways to select for children who'd be more nurturing, more socially aware, more able to use language to resolve conflicts. A known fact. And 2 of these embryos have this trait strongly expressed, and 2 have the opposite tendencies. They will be less skilled verbally, have a tendency to die at an earlier age, have a tendency to cardiovascular diseases, and nearly 100% of them will get a particular form of cancer unique to this genetic condition at some point in their lives. And the procedure for altering embryos to make them gentler and more social and nicer is established in animals. In fact, such mutation happens spontaneously even in humans in some cases. So we know that there's a difference. Which embryo do you implant? Should the other ones be discarded, and why or why not? And should all embryos be altered in this way, or the other ones who don't have it be discarded? Perhaps the human species could simply be made more altruistic, more generous of spirit. Should we do that? How many people think we should try to choose embryos who seem to us to be nicer, kinder? Someone in the back. Only one person. 2. Think of the nicest person you know, the kindest, most decent person you know. Remember I said, like Aristotle and Maimonides, right? If you could make people like that, would that be a way to go? Now, the easiest way to do this was just to choose the girl embryo, but what can I say? Okay, here's another real case. I mean, it's just all the men are eventually going to get prostate cancer. What can I say? Leo Weinberger, a scientist at UCSF, and his colleagues had devised an interesting genetic plan to genetically alter HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. It's a published piece in the literature. They take out part of the viral RNA that destroys T cells in the immune system, just the middle of the cassette, and they take it out, bad RNA, and they replace it with a weaker version of the same thing. They leave the part of the viral RNA that readily infects and replicates in human cells, and they give an altered virus in the center, right? And they have this idea about epidemics. And what they note is that most HIV virus, the weaker one, to the super spreaders themselves will spread the alternate virus, the genetically altered virus, instead of having to vaccinate everybody. And the super spreaders are the very people who would probably resist going into a vaccine clinic. They have very high-risk behaviors. They resist going into a vaccine clinic. They're probably not likely, by definition, to be using condoms. They're the ones you want. Can't we just infect them with our genetically altered, weaker virus and let them inoculate the population? Okay? What do you think? Permissible? Not permissible? Final question about naturalness. Which is more natural? Thai McDonald's, raise your hand, or Bird's Nest? We're going to vote for Bird's Nest? Okay. And the last one, this is because I'm a Californian, Yosemite or Versailles? Most natural. Yosemite? We're going to go for Yosemite. Okay, here are the test results. First of all, on naturalness. Look at the material in the nest closely. What do we see right here? You see that piece of plastic? Now, the correct answer is this idea about naturalness. And I want to destabilize your idea about naturalness because I want to take away this idea that we shouldn't alter because it's not natural. Thai McDonald's and Bird's Nest, same degree of naturalness. It is a place where little creatures take wood and mud and plastic and put it together to make a little place to feed their babies, right? Philosopher, same degree of naturalness, right? And the same thing is true, none of you are Californians, but if you were Californians, you would know that Yosemite is a garden. Yosemite is a built landscape. The reason that the valley oak is standing there alone in the meadow is because the Native Americans who lived there burned everything else. And the reason it still stays like that now is because little hordes of Boy Scouts go out there and chop out the pine trees so that it shouldn't be overgrown. And if they don't do it, there's terrible conflagrations and it all burns down. That is a created meadow, both of them equally natural. So the question of naturalness and genetics, I think it's fair to say we could put aside. We alter the world. It is what we human primates do. So here, how should we evaluate? Are there reasons in principle why performing the basic research should be impermissible? Now, these 4 questions come from a working group on genetic modifications convened a decade ago by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, with ethicists and scientists from around the country who were thinking about making permanent genetic modifications in the human genome. And the idea was, if you could alter the gene for Tay Sachs, should you alter it so that it could be the permanent elimination of a specific disease that could be then inherited? And how do you look at these new genetic information? So we argued for a year, and we came across with 4 ways to evaluate science. First, look at every intervention and ask about the principle that you are upholding, if you oppose it or if you support it. And what principle is that? And is there a principled reason why performing the basic research to think the thought should be impermissible? 2, what about context? Are there contextual factors like race or class or gender differences or histories that are so powerful that they have to be taken into account? And do any of these prevent the development and the use of the research? Now, from basic science, could it be developed or used? Third, what do we use it for? What purposes or techniques or applications would be permissible and under what circumstances? So for human embryonic stem cells, for instance, or dramatic changes in our genome might be permissible for severe fatal diseases, given the ethical constraints and the risks, but not for trivial purposes, right? Finally, how do you enforce this? What procedures, what structures, involving what policies should be used to decide on appropriate techniques and uses? Who decides? How we decide? How do we enforce it? Now, there's two models of enforcement that have traditionally been used. One is just to look at risk-benefit and to say the model here is a marketplace. It's sort of let the buyer beware. You can buy the social goods of genetics or future technologies with a sale of your risk, basically. And the cost is harm or loss. And you just negotiate that harm or loss in a marketplace sense. It can't be done, of course, unless the model is profitable. And the community, all of us, comes across in this model as a kind of a consumer. So the thing we need is information. And in this model, scientists are kind of entrepreneurs sort of selling their technology to us. And then we sort of assess it and weigh the risks and benefits. And probably when you listen to most of the very cool new science you heard in the series, that is some of the ways you thought about it, correct? Another model is European. And the European Union uses what's called the precautionary principle as opposed to risk-benefit. Here, the model is not the marketplace. Here, the model is a fixed and morally coherent nature with a capital N. Nature has an end, which is normative. Nature has a goal, which is a normative goal for nature. It is inherently good and can't be touched, and it can't be interfered with unless you know that you can make it better, right? Avoiding harm, then, is worth more than the chance of good, the risk of good, because the main thing you want to do is not make a marketplace negotiation, as in the American model, but you want to avoid harm to the stable system. The community is seen as vulnerable here, not as consumers, but as vulnerable subjects, which need protection. And scientists are seen as people who might have a significant conflict between their goods, in a personal way, and their goods as members of the larger community. See why this ends up with an American versus European difference in how to see new technology. And GM Foods was the first one that faced this confrontation. Stem cells has just faced it with its patenting. Now, there's problems with each of these concepts of how to regulate science, which is our problem number 4. The marketplace is really good for the exchange of goods. It just may not be the model for all human exchanges, especially exchanges about healing and research. And the failure, to some extent in this model, is paid for in advance. And the best way to think about this is that the Deep Horizon BP oil spill, we've already paid for that. And we paid for it by our not paying the money that oil would really cost us if we were really going to pay. So we already paid for it in a sense. So we have to really now clean it up, because all of us, including the people in the Gulf who got the jobs, we all got the cheaper oil through the drilling structure, right? So we sort of pay for these things in advance. And it's really based in the deep triumph of autonomy. Each of us making these choices and calculations, and the entrepreneurs making their own choices. The precautionary principle has problems too. Bad outcomes are going to occur if you go ahead or if you do not go ahead. Precaution on the road ahead does not protect you from the harm, it just makes you stand still, right? So the cost of retreat then is entirely borne by the most vulnerable and not the most powerful. And the best way to think about this is to think about the polio vaccine. In a precautionary principle model, polio vaccine may not have been chosen to go forward. It was high risk. They needed vulnerable subjects to experiment on. I was an early subject, I might add, and turned out okay, I hope. But it was a vulnerable risk, and it might have altered the world in ways that were destabilizing. But if we could have made the choice not to go ahead, but you wouldn't have gone ahead in a world that would have been safe. It would have been gone ahead in a world without polio vaccines. The problem with the precautionary principle is that it doesn't really keep the future from happening. It will just happen without the intervention. And it's based, however, in EU ideas of solidarity and of its deep concern with the shadow of history and of the Nazi misuse of power. So there's problems in each concept. That's why I'm going to suggest, in conclusion, the consideration of another model when you think about these cool new future technologies. And when you ask the question, how would the future be shaped by us, and not how the future will shape us, I want you to think about fidelity as a principle in bioethics. The model of fidelity, faithfulness, is a debt relationship between a doctor and a patient, or a scientist and a community, in which the doctor has a debt to the patient. And why is that? Because the patient or the community has offered up their body so the scientist can be a scientist. And therefore the scientist or the doctor owes back this enormous gift that can almost never be repaid. Now, both harm and benefit are going to happen. Harm will happen. High-risk science will create mistakes. Risk and harm will happen. And I think, because I'm an optimist, though a worried one, I think benefit will happen, and they're part of the model. The scientific interests should be within the community, but conflicts are inevitable because there are different interests between communities and scientists, and that's just going to be true too. The premise in how to work it out isn't a marketplace, but I'm going to suggest essential narratives of justice that I find deeply in Hebrew scripture, New Testament theology, and in the Quran. Others can find them other places. That's where Locke and Jefferson found them, so I find them there too. And the idea here is that everything essentially belongs to us collectively, given to us by God, and that the corners of the field are held in trust for the poor, and that the premise of justice means whatever is good and gained by this extraordinary explosion of scientific knowledge and wealth creation and change creation doesn't belong to us alone. It belongs also to the poor who stand at the corners of the field, to the vulnerable. The premise here and the promise is for witness to their suffering, to a duty to respond, and to a sense of altruism by everyone. In the recent book that's caused so much interest and controversy about Henrietta Lacks and her HeLa cells, I think the attention about what you get is displaced. It should be on promoting people to give more, to give everything, to promote the duty of altruism rather than the marketplace negotiation. Now, for that to work, science has to be very transparent, scientists have to be very honest, and subjects and researchers have to understand the great courage it takes to do science. To be a scientist is to be a man and a woman who is brave, and to be a research subject takes tremendous courage as well. We're going to fail at most of our best hopes because it's a science project, and all you students know that failure is part of experiment. It's how we learn anything. It's not on getting it right the first time. And the courage that is the most beautiful part of the scientific enterprise is a part of our scientific future as well. Okay, which means what? I think we need to rethink basic ideas about autonomy and privacy and harm and what they mean. And I think scientists who've been thinking in a very good way about their future and have done a lot of tricky, clever work already need philosophers and ethicists and citizen discourse to catch up with that and to rethink what we mean by autonomy and privacy and harm. We need to have finally a very serious debate about what it means to own, what it means to patent something, and what our duties to the poor are as we advance in science. I want to just end by telling you a thoughtful reminder: the future doesn't belong to us. In fact, the faith we have in having children, in my case in having grandchildren, knowing grandchildren, I haven't had them, right, means that I trust that they, not me, are the beings of the future. And this deep idea that one doesn't own your body, your land, your world, your future, one inhabits it, one shares it in community, is an idea that we need to spend some serious attention on. So to review and conclude, yes, it is true. The beautiful, elegant science that you've seen this fall creates unfolding human capacities nearly beyond our ability to imagine them. Should we do all that we can? Why? Why not? Which of these capacities should we pursue? And how do we decide? Will the pursuit of some change our character or our society? What are the duties of the scientists? What are the duties of physicians? And finally, what are your duties as citizens? Immanuel Kant, in thinking about knowledge, thinks about three essential questions about how to regard the world. What can I know? What ought I to do? And then finally, for what can I hope? And this notion of hopefulness is how I want to end. I hope that whatever the human future is, it includes this very sort of face-to-face encounter in which our considerations about who we are as hopeful beings, who we will be, who we will live, how we will regard the face of the other, those questions continue to be at the core of our scientific advances. So thank you, and I'm ready for your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we do have quite a few questions here. Hopefully we'll be able to get through a bunch of them. So one of the first ones was, what ethical issues would you anticipate regarding developing a full understanding of the human brain?
Of the human brain?
The human brain, yeah.
I like the idea of developing a full understanding of the human brain as much as it is possible. The question I have is, describing it doesn't mean we will know the moral possibilities of the brain. And describing it, if there's a fear that it might constrain it, or we might be tempted to constrain it, raises questions about who will make the decisions about what's considered a good or bad action. So I think those are the ethical questions that might occur. I'm going to have to think about that. I'm not sure. I wonder what. Let's just assume for a minute that it's possible to have a map of the brain in the way that we might have a map of the genome. One of the things that's cool about thinking about this is when the genome was first mapped, they had this whole category called junk DNA. And then it wasn't, right? And the calculations were wrong. So when we have a map, remember, it'll just be our first brush at the map. And, it's a continuing and evolving problem. So I worry that we might think we know it all before we really do. But that's a trivial problem considering the enormous gift that it would be to really know and be able to chart what's going on in the human brain.
Okay. So do you consider the acts of the FDA, I guess the Food and Drug Administration, immoral in keeping valuable drugs out of the market purely by making the costs to certify drugs too high? And they note that the FDA requires hundreds of millions of dollars, which effectively prices out low-cost but effective drugs.
No, I'm glad there's an FDA because I want to know that I'm not being poisoned or given quack fakey things when I put them in my mouth. And before there was an FDA that regulated them, people died from bad tetanus vaccine, and that's why the FDA regained that power to test vaccines. So I'm really glad that testing is highly regulated, and I'm sorry that it takes a long time, but it takes a long time to learn things that are important to us. However, about the money piece, any drug company that feels all sad about how expensive it is could renegotiate how much profit they make and how much they pay their scientists. I'm sorry.
Okay. So if we could make ourselves faster, stronger, better memory, immune system, the whole gamut, would we stop considering ourselves Homo sapiens?
No, I don't think so. I think that the essence of our being is more than the sum of our physical capacities. And in fact, one way we know this is actually because if I said to you, do you want to double the human lifespan? Will that change who it is that we are? Many of you would be uneasy. Double the human lifespan, wow. But in fact, we already did that. Human beings used to be smaller and less strong. They couldn't run as fast. Look at the Olympic scores, right? And they lived to about 35. We've changed profoundly in exactly the ways that I suggested. And in fact, we're still very Homo sapien. And in fact, the remarkable ability is when you're confronted by the first gestures of Homo sapienness, which is religious burial practices, which suggest that people believe that there's an afterlife. You're struck by how similar we still are, even though in many of those human capacities that I just proposed we might enhance, We're quite different.
Okay. So if a scientist or a group of scientists find a cure to a certain disease, is it immoral for them to want to patent their own hard work?
Me, yes. I think that's, I don't believe, I'm with Jonas Salk. I think people should be paid a just wage for the hard and elegant and good work that they do. But I actually think that the gesture of healing and the gesture of basic scientific inquiry might potentially happen better if it happened outside of the marketplace exchange.
Okay. So I like this question, and a little background is we had Anthony Atala here a few weeks ago talking about printing human organs, and that was a pretty impressive talk if you saw it. And after the lecture, we asked him, in the future, being 20, 30 years out, could you print out a whole person? And he, without batting an eye, said, yes, no problem. Fire up the printer, and there we are. So is that immoral, or is that ethical? If you could just print out a person?
The question is, what does it mean to be a person, right? A person that is a printed entity, a simulacrum of a person, how will we regard that being, right? And it's very similar to other questions about robots or creatures in space. And I'm kind of tolerant about this thing. If someone can actually have a conversation with me, right, and like do something like care about the Red Sox or the Cubs, it's probably like my test of personhood.
We could probably print a baseball hat, too.
There you go, right? If you can understand baseball and keep rooting for that underdog, right, despite it all, the tests of who's in and who's out for me have to do with your capacity for language, for love, for compassion, for location in the central narratives of human thought and life. So I'm less concerned about the immigrant status of new beings than I am concerned about our capacity to love beings that we understand are like us.
Okay. So in your professional career, what have you seen that's the most surprising in terms of radical changes related to ethics and questions that have come up?
That is a fabulous question, whoever came up with that. The most surprising. I am really intrigued by synthetic biology. I think that actually creates some genuinely new questions for us about our power. It extends our power in ways that I think raise some serious questions. Though I have to say, one of my personal favorites is the should we go to Mars question. You have to do like, what should human primates do with other planets? And when you encountered a life form there, how would you get? And it's the same question as your printed man. How would you know that it's fully human? What does it mean to be human? So questions like that challenge our species being. But in actual fact, I think a question that we haven't solved yet is a real challenge, and it's a puzzle I can't figure, which is, why is it that though we love children, and we care so much for embryos, clearly, why is it that our foster care system is in such total chaotic disrepair and so deeply in need? Why do we let children grow up in poverty? Why don't we fund schools? So the basic questions of social justice against all this brilliant, beautiful, cool science, that discrepancy, that distance has always been the haunting ethical question that I keep wanting to, even though I'm always snatched off by these cool questions, I think essentially the core question, the main show and not the side show, is what we do about human justice and injustice.
Good. Okay, we'll do two more here. So do you see the need for commitment to faith growing in the future, or do you see it decreasing?
The need for faith?
Yeah.
You know, of all the things that have changed and not changed about human life, the thing that's most durable is our complete devotion to a life world of faith. It's really interesting. It's a powerful story, a powerful part of our species being that I see everywhere. And I am deeply impressed with the power of faithful compassion, of the power for faithful witness, and of the way that people pray is all over the world in all different ways, in all different societies, and throughout human history. It's this extraordinary relationship of self to the other and self to the world that is one of the most durable and definitively human encounters we have with between self and other. So it's so essential. It's so core to our being. And every time Time magazine says a God is dead moment, or people think about the increasing secularity of the world, we're stunned by how deeply unsecular the world turns out to be. So that enduring passion to me is of tremendous importance, and I think we disregarded it at some cost.
Okay. One question. So which countries in the world do you think are doing the best job reconciling science, ethics, and politics?
Well, you know, I like America. I like the chaos of our debate. I really do. I like having a big fight about what things that matter very deeply. And when I come here, I think it's fascinating. I've been in. Let me say briefly. There's an interesting debate in France and in Germany called open science discourse. And in some of those countries, they have town hall meetings like this all the time, but in a more formal way, where the scientists really do have to present their work to others, to councils, and have it judged. And I'm interested in that. That's, by the way, how France worked out its nuclear power arrangements, was with a science negotiation, a public scientist negotiation, and that's why they have a plan for nuclear power and for nuclear waste that's really quite different. The way climate change has been debated in, say, Denmark, quite differently from here, speaks to the kind of relationship between educated polity and scientists that I admire. I admire what Denmark is doing around climate change. So those are the ones that I attend to and I think are of interest. What will be interesting is how India and China and Mexico and Brazil, the BRCA countries, make the same discussions happen as they leap ahead of us in some of their technologies.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more. That's a question just squeaked in on a note card. So, could not funding science projects of some type be unethical, even if the money is taken from education or health, and consider the abandonment of space research?
There is a point in which not funding science publicly has two unethical implications. The first is science that's not funded publicly can get funded privately. And the private funding of science drives science into the marketplace with all of its temptations and all of its need for secrecy and all of its inherent injustice, potential for injustice, not always injustice, but the temptations for the collection and privatization of science, I think is a problem. That's why I'm a defender of science. I think it has to be robustly funded. And I think if you fund it robustly as a polity, then you have the right to look at it and to regulate it and to have it freely witnessed and freely observed and not patented, available to you, right? So I think there's better chances for justice and for honesty when the public funds it and the public supports it. I also think science is the way we say knowledge in the 21st century. It just is. I mean, I wish philosophy was publicly funded too, but there you go. It's how we think. We learn what is real about the world, so of course it should be a public enterprise. And I don't think there's a way to disconnect funding for good science and advanced science and funding for education. I think that it's knowledge and the creation of knowledge and then the dissemination of knowledge from the elementary school through the secondary school through the graduate school level is the engine that drives societies. I think there's no other such engine except engines of religious or family institutions. But these are one of the major things. Of course we have to fund it. And I think that there's money enough in our society to fund both robust public schools and a robust attention to science discourse and to the most creative ideas possible. And I think if we rethought how we thought about income and worth and how wealth is regarded in this country and renegotiated at the deepest level, there would be money to fund that which we value collectively, and science really has to be at the forefront. To abandon science is to really turn from our future. It's not to say that I don't worry about it, or that I don't think there's ethical implications. I think ethics has to go right along with science. And I think nagging at their heels and saying, what about this question and what sort of world do we want? Insisting on funding for public education, insisting on funding for the poor, and insisting that the direction and the telos of science be towards the poor, that there's a preferential option for the poor even, could be a focus of our energy and concern rather than squabbling over funding between those two entities. Both have to be supported and are both important. And I think there's money to be had in this society. It just has to be, there has to be a tough choice about profits. And that choice is, that the case for that choice is being made even as we speak, and I'm glad that it is.
Great. Thank you very much. Before we scatter, I'll just remind you that next week there's no lecture. We'll give you a week off for Thanksgiving. The following week, the 29th, we'll have Richard Clark here talking about cyber warfare and cybersecurity. Should be very interesting. And then we'll conclude on the 6th of December with student presentations from our parallel honors class. So thank you very much for attending, and see you in a couple weeks.